against the Australian government over climate inaction. The Torres Strait Eight are kind of complaining that their human rights, including the right to culture, the right to life, and the right to be free from arbitrary interference with one's home, have been violated, and they have been pushing for the Australian government to take remedial action in respect of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. So my first slide says solidarity with Torres Strait Islanders on the front lines of climate change. Our islands, our home, the Torres Strait Eight. Really, this work is part of a larger body of work that I've been doing over many years, looking at intellectual property and Indigenous rights and climate change. So I am based at the Faculty of Business and Law in the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Queensland, the Sunshine State of Australia. As is always the case, I'd also like to do a kind of a welcome to country. The Queensland University of Technology acknowledges the Turrbal and Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands where QT now stands. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and we recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. QT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QT community. And my presentation today is certainly about Indigenous rights of Torres Strait Islanders in Queensland and Australia. So just to begin with, both my parents are geographers, so I think it's quite important to situate my talk in its particular geography. The Torres Strait Islands are really a collection of islands between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and the Indigenous communities in the Torres Strait have a very kind of distinctive identity and set of communities. As you can see from this map, really the constellation of locations in the state of Queensland and just in the strait between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Torres Strait Islanders have played a very kind of important role in the Australian legal system previously. So the landmark case involving Eddie Mabo in Australia led to the recognition of native title rights for Indigenous nations and communities in Australia. So where it could be demonstrated that Indigenous communities still had a connection to the land or water, they could still claim Indigenous land title rights called native title rights. So in this very kind of important precedent, the High Court of Australia rejected the myth of terra nullius, the notion that Australia was somehow empty land before the arrival of the British colonisers. I guess Australia is a stark contrast in some respects to its near neighbour New Zealand, which has the Treaty of Waitangi, which recognises the relationship between the Crown and Maori nations. There has been kind of ongoing debate in Australia over self-determination and Indigenous rights. In particular, there has been a push of late for the adoption of the Buluru Statement from the Heart. And that makes three particular requests. It calls for there to be a treaty. It calls for a process of truth-telling, but it also asks for there to be an Indigenous voice in relation to policy making that affects Indigenous communities. In that context, the Torres Strait Eight action is very significant. Really, it is an objection by representatives of Torres Strait Islanders about the adverse impacts climate change is having upon their communities, and the failure of the Australian government to kind of take effective climate action or to fulfil their duty of care towards those Indigenous communities. So to begin with, I'll just kind of outline who the Torres Strait Eight include. Essentially, the Torres Strait Eight involve representatives of the Torres Strait Land and Sea Council called Gur A Baradharaw Kod, and they include Yessi Mosby and Nazareth Warrior of Massac, York Island, Keith Payby and Stanley Marama of Buluru, Nazareth Fowd of Purima, Coconut Island, and Ted Billy, Daniel Billy, and Kabay Tamu of Warraber, Sioux Island. This action has been framed in light of past native title actions, such as the Mabo case, to obtain land and sea rights. And it was kind of announced in the lead up to Mabo Day. And the plaintiffs said that this claim is highlighting the next chapter in our story, ensuring our traditional culture survives climate change. So the complaint has been made under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The complainants observe that right now, king tides, cyclones, and coral bleaching are threatening the homes and cultures of Torres Strait Islander people, while the Australian government refuses to address the climate crisis. The Torres Strait Island Eight are demanding that Australia rapidly reduce its emissions and provide sufficient resourcing of adaptation measures. So they're kind of complaints about a violation of the right to culture, the right to be free from arbitrary interference, and the right to life. In relation to the right to culture, one of the complainants, Kabay Tamu, has noted, we have a right to practice our culture in our traditional homeland where we belong. Our culture has a value that no money could ever compensate for. Our culture starts here on the land. It is how we are connected with the land and the sea. You wash away the land and it's like a piece of us you are taking away. Mosby has been also particularly distressed by the impact of sea level rise on ancestral remains, noting some of our loved ones have now been taken by the sea. We've had to move some of our other relatives and relocate them due to inundation that brought them out and revealed their remains. So really this has been framed in terms of the right to culture. And I guess the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also kind of talks about the importance of the right to culture, as well as Indigenous intellectual property. And I think this dispute, amongst other things, is really about the impact of climate change on traditional knowledge. In terms of the right to be free from arbitrary interference with privacy, family and home, Danny Billy commented, it's our right to be here, to have a voice, to be recognised and to make others realise that this is our home. We have a right to live a healthy life here on our island. And in relation to the right to life, Yessi Mosby has noted that climate change poses an existential threat to the people of the Torres Strait Islands. The threat of being displaced, he says, is one felt across the diverse Torres Strait Islands. This would be a catastrophe for Torres Strait Islanders. Our land is the string connecting us to our culture. It ties us to who we are. If we were to move, we would be like helium balloons disconnected from our culture. Our culture would become extinct. So the Torres Strait Eight are represented by ClientEarth, who are kind of a transnational environmental charity. Their lead lawyer is Sophie Marjanik. They also have a number of barristers from the London and Victorian bars who are appearing on their behalf and providing advice. There will be a very kind of messy issue in relation to the admissibility of the claim. Often it's the case that the United Nations bodies ask for parties to exhaust their national options for remedies before bringing in international action. So Greta Thunberg and others recently tried to bring an action about the impact of climate change on children's rights. And they were told that they first have to kind of bring their action at a national level first. Should be noted that this action has also been supported by climate scientists. Professor Leslie Hughes and others has kind of talked about the impact of climate change and coastal flooding, particularly upon the Torres Strait. The UN Special Rapporteurs for Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd and John Knox, have also written a brief in support of the action. And it's notable that the United Nations has just recognised a right to a healthy environment. The Australian government, for its part, has asked the committee to dismiss the petition. It has maintained that its policies regarding climate change are consistent with international human rights obligations. They also have suggested that the case should in any case be dismissed because it concerns future risks rather than present challenges. But also Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, who's on the right there, next to Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, he has been arguing that the Morrison government has made considerable contributions to the development of coastal infrastructure for the Torres Strait Islanders. In reply, the Torres Strait Islanders have been upset that Australia has been denying that it cannot be held responsible for the global issue of climate change. They have said that it's disingenuous to claim that climate change is an issue that Australia is currently committed to tackling. Yessi Mosby has said that the government has a duty of care, and that duty extends to all Australians, not just for the people who live down on the mainland. He says, tell the truth. You're not trying your best to help us. Stop lying. In addition to the legal action, there's also been a petition being run by the Torres Strait 8, and the Torres Strait 8 are also going to be involved in the coming months for the next Australian election. Yessi Mosby has said, our vision is to burn a fire in the hearts of people calling for justice in relation to climate change. And I guess I'd just like to conclude by noting that it is also possible that this international action might well become a domestic action against the Australian government. And last night, there was an announcement that in relation to climate action, 2 Torres Strait Islanders were bringing an action against the Australian government, saying that their duty of care had not been respected and that the Torres Strait had been adversely impacted by climate change. So it'll be very interesting to see how that action proceeds. But we've also had a few landmark actions in Australia in which climate litigation has been successful. So there's been the Rocky Hill case, the bushfire survivors case, and also another action, Sharma versus the environment. Moreover, the action by the Torres Strait Islands has also had parallel actions in relation to the Pacific Islands. So Vanuatu has just announced that it is going to seek an opinion from the International Court of Justice about the impact of climate change on the rights of Pacific Islanders. So to kind of conclude my talk, I think the Torres Strait 8 case is a really important precedent, raising issues about climate change, biodiversity, Indigenous intellectual property, and traditional knowledge. And no doubt there'll be a range of other global climate litigation, particularly dealing with how climate change is impacting upon the traditional knowledge of Indigenous communities. If you have any questions or queries, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you very much. It has been an honour and privilege to participate in the Global Congress on Intellectual Property and the Public Interest. And I hope my story about the Torres Strait 8 resonates with many of you across networks in relation to the intellectual property community. Thank you very much.
We just finished the streaming. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, the early morning in Australia and all the university lights are on an automated system.
I figured when you tell it, I figured it out.
There was a little bit of a
Okay.
blackout towards the end, so sorry about that.
Okay. Okay, have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Good luck for the rest of your